Welcome everybody to Terminal. My name is Nabil. I'm the head of partnerships here. We're absolutely thrilled to welcome you to our office in Kitchener-Waterloo. We have offices across Canada, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, and we're thrilled to be able to provide the Terminal Tech Talk series, which is a national monthly free education series designed to give back to the ecosystems in which we operate. Just by show of hands, who's first time at a Terminal Tech Talk here? Very cool, very cool. How many people in the room have actually heard of Terminal before? Very cool, awesome. I'd also like to just take a brief moment to describe the speakers today, who we're very, very lucky to have with us. So I'll start with Nicole on the far left. And so I first actually met Nicole when she was my professor in business school, easily one of my favorite professors of all time. And so
he's never said that before.
Yeah. And so yeah, at the time she was the Betty and Peter Sims Professor for Entrepreneurship, but now she's the research director at the Lazaridis Institute and so much more. So Nicole received her PhD in marketing and international business from the University of Auckland. She also holds a Master in Science, as well as a Bachelor of Commerce in Marketing, and the Masters of Sciences in Technology Management, and that's from the University of Saskatchewan. In 2010, she received an honorary doctorate from the Turku School of Economics in Finland. Through her career, Nicole has held academic appointments in New Zealand, Canada, Finland, and now she is the inaugural Lazaridis Research Director at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. We're lucky to have her here. Nicole is also Research Director at the Lazaridis Institute for Management of Technology Enterprises. She studies high-growth technology firms focusing on a variety of topics at the intersection of marketing strategy, international business, and entrepreneurship. Her work is published in the top journals across all of the disciplines mentioned, and Nicole's current research program involves projects in Canada, Spain, France, Finland, and Germany. In 2006, Nicole was recognized as Laurier University Research Professor, and in 2014, she was ranked as the #2 scholar worldwide for international marketing. Nicole was also ranked 18th in the world for international business, the only female in the top 20 on that list. Well done, Nicole.
Is there some way you could have gone with me first? Graduated high school, yeah. This is graduated.
Okay, are you ready for this now? Are you ready for this? So Steve is the president of SSIMWAVE. Previously, Steve was the vice president of startup services at Communitech, working with hundreds of startups and one of the best advisors of all time there. As well, Steve was the chief executive officer and president of Bearing Media, and he served as the chief executive officer and president of Atria Networks, LP. Atria Networks was exited to Rogers for $425 million. And actually before that, Steve left an illustrious 16-year career at Bell and started FCI Broadband in Richmond Hill, which was the first company in all of North America to bring all three services to the home on a single strand of cable. So internet, TV, and phone. Fiber cable. Fiber cable. Fiber to the home, yeah, first company. And of course, and he also sold that company to Rogers as well. So from a private sector perspective, Steve's particularly qualified to talk about scaling businesses. And also prior to Atria, earlier he co-founded Concilium Utilities Asset Corp. Basically, Steve sits on a ton of boards. He was on the board of Sandvine. He's on the board of the Hydro Company. So I'll just leave it there. He's one of the top advisors, and I was lucky enough to call him my boss back at Communitech, where easily the best manager I've had so far in my career.
Right beside the best professor he's ever had. The coincidence is
Does he call you his father? He calls me his academic mother.
No, I'm much too young. I'm much too young for that.
I thought so too.
So even before we start, I really want to emphasize one key thing, is that this is a conversation. So we're here for you. So if you have questions, just raise your hand at any time. This is not, something where we want to follow an official program. People on the live stream, same idea. If you have questions, just ask them right away, and we'll make sure that we try and get to as many questions as possible, because again, this is for you. But that being said, today's talk is how to build locally and scale globally, and so we want to talk through some examples in your experience. And so in terms of how you've worked with other companies that scaled up, and you could pick whichever ones you want, whether it be Sandvine or FCI or Atria, but can you give us a sense about at what point in those companies' histories did you know that you needed to go beyond HQ? Did you know that you needed to hire people elsewhere or build elsewhere accordingly?
Well, most of them are bad examples because they were very domestic.
Okay.
So, what I found so far is that if your facility's based, you've got factories, you've got wires, you can make a good business domestically. What I found, though, to flip this a little bit, so take Sandvine, which made hardware, but had to export to a tremendous number of companies. That would be the inverse. So I think, for me, the kicker is that, and the conversation I really think would be helpful, would be not to get too specific, because every story is so unique, but rather to talk about the fact that Canada does not punch above its weight. So KW often, I feel, does, but collectively Canada does not. And then we keep comparing to the US. And so Sandvine, biggest customer is US. SSIMWAVE, where I am now, 90% of all our revenue to date, United States. It's an attractive, easy partner. But the flip side of that is Taiwan, South Korea, Israel, those countries all punch above their weight. And so there's a sense of urgency there, right, for a whole bunch of reasons in each country's case. I guess South Korea is a little bit more people than us, but essentially they're all small countries. So why would we compare ourselves to the largest economy on the planet when really the lessons, I think, for us would be elsewhere? So now to turn that again, I would say in every case, somewhere along the way, each one of the companies that we've referenced got some help. And I think the help came from expertise that I've never taken government money, but took lots of government assistance. So I would say it's market size. And the fundamental question that I'd really like us to address here is how the hell could you be a large scaling billion-dollar company in a country of 35 million people? And the answer is you can't. So I don't know how Nicole feels, but I'd say the bottom line premise for me is, with few exceptions, you have to be international. And look at those other countries, and they all know they have to be international. So then I'd ask, how after that? Is that, I'm avoiding specific companies. The reason I am is not because I'm not happy to talk about them, but I don't think it gives you any insight. Like I've only done 4 or 5 companies, and so I know things about 4 or 5 companies. But I would caution everyone here, having seen, I don't even know, 1,800 startups while I was at Communitech, no 2 stories are the same.
Right.
But a lot of these systems have a lot of common elements, and I'm sure you've seen many of these.
Yeah, and Nicole, in your research, in particular, as a
Did you notice me answer the question I wished you'd asked me?
Well, that was great.
I took training in that.
Yeah, that was good. That was great. And so, yeah, and for Nicole, your research has shown, you were particularly focused on new technology enterprises and the internationalization process of software companies and some of the work that you've done. And so in that regard, what has the research shown us in terms of how companies internationalize and when they decide to internationalize and that sort of thing?
I think the research you're talking about is research that I didn't do here, actually. It was coming out of New Zealand.
Okay.
But that leads to a related point from this conversation you just had with Steve, is that when I look at what Canada's trying to do, I do not in any way, shape, or form compare it to what happens in the US. And typically when I talk about where firms might consider it to be appealing in terms of market entry, I put the US quite low on the list because it is highly competitive, it's price competitive, you get into big wars and you get sucked up and spit out really quickly. That's not for all firms, but for many small firms, that's really not a viable option, and there's nothing wrong with going around. And that was a lesson I learned in New Zealand. Looking at small open economies like New Zealand, like Finland, Sweden, the UK for that matter, it's not like the US in terms of size. They always took let's go around the US market and then figure out how to get into the US market. Let's not start with the US market. And that was an interesting learning or a lesson for me. I think in the context of Canadian firms going abroad, one of the pieces of research. So at the Lazaridis Institute, where I am the research director, we do annual research to try and understand what it is that drives high growth with Canadian technology firms. And we know for sure now, after 3 years of consecutive seeing this coming through, is that it is international sales revenue that drives overall performance for the organization. And the firms that are performing well internationally, about 83% of them are going beyond the US, and I mean everywhere in the world, maybe plus the US, but it's a world market for them. And these are firms that are growing in excess of 100% per annum. And they're not, and the reason I'm making that point is, and it's a slightly careful one to make, is because the OECD talks about a high growth company as being growing at 20% per annum year over year for 3 years. You look at Deloitte's Fast 50, and some of those companies that get onto the Fast 50 list for the first time, they're growing at, 70,000%. And then they fall off the list. What we're interested in is companies that are growing at maybe 100, 120, 140% per annum year after year after year after year. So what is it that allows that? It's international revenue. And what is it that allows that? That is actually building and leveraging networks. And it's understanding the business network that you're in, the position you hold in that network, the position you want to hold in that network, who has the power in the network, who is the conduit in terms of if I want to get there, how do I get there, who do I know that I can leverage? It's a very strategic approach to managing the contacts.
Yeah. Actually, that's pretty interesting. So going back to the two companies where we ran fiber, we did precisely that, only just in Ontario. So Toronto was ferociously competitive, and there were many, many carriers in Toronto competing. And so we went everywhere but Toronto. And so it was sort of a guerrilla concept. So we were up in the hills, we got our skills down, we got our costs down, we became hyper efficient, then we took Toronto. And so, I think that's a really interesting model because that's precisely what we did twice.
Others would say, sorry to interrupt, Nabil, others would say that if you can make it in the US, you can make it anywhere, but the price you pay for trying to make it in the US could be prohibitive.
Or your whole company.
Oh, yeah.
It'll be sold.
Yeah.
Ray?
You entertain dissenting opinions.
No, thank you, Ray.
So I understand what you're saying. I sort of disagree. I've done a few of them. I found that once you get into the U.S., for starters, Americans are happier to buy Canadian stuff than Canadians are a lot of the time. Secondly, if you establish yourself in the U.S., then when you go international, it's like you've got credibility because Americans are buying your stuff. So I went to the U.S., then Australia, then the Middle East, then China, then Europe. And I've done it a couple times. And yeah, the U.S. has challenges, but it's a lot less trouble than going into China or the Middle East on your first.
Oh, for sure. And I think, so there's a couple of points in there. One is that you've done it a couple times, which means you've had experience doing it. And if you've got some experience in the team that's been there, done that, that helps a whole lot. But if you haven't had that experience of moving into a new market before, and this is your first go, that's a tough hit. I would rather go to a market like Australia or the UK that has, we think about the US as being very similar. Yes, they speak mostly the same language, variations on English, just like we do in Canada. But every state has its own individual laws. The power of the lobbyist in the US is incredible. There's lots of subtle differences that we don't really acknowledge right out of the starting gate. And so, in fact, New Zealand's too small, but Australia's not a lot bigger, but it is bigger than New Zealand. And the UK are closer to us in many ways than the US is, just in terms of how we think and do business. But I agree. If you've got experience behind you, the US is more attractive.
And the other one, unfortunately, is cost of travel. I can drive across the border and fly anywhere in the US fairly cheaply. Getting to Australia is a little pricey, especially if you're too old to fly economy.
Any other questions at this time? All right. Yep, Bill.
Now this is very specific to software, is it? The reason I ask is that when we're dealing with structural things, where you have to be attentive, be close, and be able to support beyond the ground, especially in the early scaling stages. You've validated the product, but you validated it in a sub-market. As you expand it, you really don't want to be too far away, or else you can lose control over that. And failures that happen in other areas, doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter where you are, they're going to hear about it in your big prospect markets. So I'm just wondering if you're more software related versus hardware related?
My comments would have been leaning more towards software and moving into the SaaS world, but in the context of hardware, let's use North as a, for instance, Focals by North, which we're all going to be wearing soon, I hope. I've asked them when they're going to come out with prescription lenses that are bifocals, because that's what I need. They've got prescription, just not the bifocals. They're going into New York for pretty much the reason that you're talking about. But they have a very unique kind of high-end luxury item for the consumer goods market, and they've got somebody like Alexis Ohanian tweeting about it this week, about how he's getting his Focals by North. So for them, that is a sensible decision to go into New York, because it is right next door. Going into the US for a hardware firm that doesn't have... Let me hand it over to Steve for a moment while I craft an answer.
What do you think? Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, let's use a live example. So SSIMWAVE's done really well in the US. We do video. So we do video quality, viewer perception on video quality. And of course, the center of the entertainment industry, other than India for its own content purposes, is still primarily the United States. And most of the over-the-top players are still power-based in the United States as well. And Sky, which was doing really well and was our client of ours, suddenly became part of Comcast. And so that just reintegrates everything back in the United States. And so there's no avoiding that, Bill, in that case. And so, but we do know that we can only grow a limited amount even with the United States. And so in looking at market size, Canada's a non-starter. So I'll give you an example. In Canada, you've got 3 of the top 5 carriers, and this really essentially is only 5 carriers. That's only about 6 or 7 million households. Comcast in the United States has 22 million. Sky had 22 million. These are big numbers. And so it does speak to, you've got to figure out what you need. And so at $1 per, or 10 cents per, or whatever it is, do your math. I think you've still got to go international. And I don't think you want to be held hostage by the United States. So it's this weird balancing. So I think, Ray, you make good points. I wouldn't rush off to China. We went twice in my time at the latter part of Communitech and found it a highly complex thing to be doing. It's not reciprocal in any way, shape, or form. The contracts aren't reciprocal. The respective intellectual property rights aren't quite reciprocal. But they're a powerhouse, and you can't ignore them. Pardon me?
The world's worst alcohol.
In that white bottle? Oh dear God, yeah. Yeah, that's, oh God, yeah. But not all that to say know the market. And so yes, United States is easy because it's the same language, et cetera, but you're also talking to the homegrowns at the same time.
But there's a point that you made, and this maybe goes, is it Bill?
Yes.
Comes back to Bill's point, is you followed your customers. So if your core customers are in the US, that's a driving force. So they are pulling you into that marketplace. Now, presumably, if you already have a relationship with them, you have a starting point that you are going to be able to lever into that marketplace, and maybe you need to set up and have a footprint there. Going in without that kind of a relationship, or some other type of, if you're not piggybacking on another organization, I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Pablo? Can I argue that it's easier to penetrate the US because since the market is so much larger, you can find more niche customers, so you can close the sale faster. And also they're much more aggressive towards trying a new product than a Canadian would, because they're trying to get ahead so much quicker. So there's also the benefit that when you sell to the US, the sales are much faster, it's much more aggressive, and there's more customers that are going to fit your niche in such a way that the sale is going to close faster.
I think you find, if you've got a niche offer, you will have customers all over the world. And if you're coming out of this particular community, which has a brand associated with it and a credibility associated with it, they're interested in what's coming out of this market. Perhaps the US customers are going to be more aggressive. They're also going to be more aggressive on price, more aggressive on terms, more aggressive on service. And that can break a company pretty easily, especially if it's constrained in terms of its capital, financial capital.
Claudius?
Where does the immigration component come in here because going into the States and you want to bring talent in, it's very hard, especially now with the Trump factor. While Canada is now becoming very attractive. There's a lot of people that are wanting to come to Canada to take up tech jobs and they're coming from Silicon Valley because they're there for 20 years and they'll never become residents, and at least here they have a chance. So does that come into play at all in when you decide where you want to go?
I can tell you it does for us. So we have a very small team in the United States. All of the R&D, all of the development work is here for that reason. One of the first things I had to do when I got there was set up a US entity in order that we had a hiring agency in the United States for that purpose. Not every country requires you to do that. And I can also tell you, I thought Canadian taxes were bad. US taxes are a nightmare. We pay taxes in, I think, 40 states, and we only have 5 customers. And the math, if you saw the math to do that, it was months of an accountant's time to do the taxes. So there are complications, but the easy part is they all speak the common language. They have lots of things in common. It's much easier to strike up social environments. You don't put your foot in it as much. So it cuts both ways. But yeah, we're attracting everyone to here. From as far away as India and the Middle East, our employees are coming to Canada. We wouldn't even attempt to get them to the United States.
With the Lazaridis 10, so I'm with the Lazaridis Institute, and we have 10 companies each year. This year we'll have cohort number 3, and then the women's cohort is starting in March. They're being selected at this moment. We take them down to the Valley, and it's not so that they're getting funding from the US, it's so that they can learn from how business is done in the Valley and how meetings are held and who the key players might be and useful people to learn from and or piggyback off of or partner with as they're moving forward. Most of them are looking at an international market, not always, and I mean international beyond the US. One of our companies this year is called VanHack, and their business is bringing in talent from all over the world to Canada. And they are recognizing that, there's a hole in the market and we're going to fill it, basically, in terms of the opportunity to do this. I'm not sure if your question was about going into the US. No, it was the opposite.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Fun fact, Claudius used to head up border security for the federal government
how cool.
for about 40 years here.
Yeah.
Who else? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sam. We're a digital agency with a primary focus on SEO. So, does the Canadian dollar, value, could play a role in also making this argument winning towards these states? Because, for example, like us, when we provide a service to a US-based client, we have a competitive advantage versus other competitors in the US. And we have done this exercise before, and it proved that's. So, do you think this could be a sign for us that we should try to build on this and try to penetrate to the US market because of that?
Well, I think, just to be clear on my position, I don't think there's anything wrong with going to the US market. I'm just saying you have to get enough market if you want to grow and scale a business. And so if we're talking scale, I think Navdeep Bains these days wants 40%, so not quite as high an accelerating rate as that. 40% is remarkable. Jeff, you've got lots of experience. How many companies are even growing at 40% that you saw?
Not many.
Not very many. So to get to 100, 150, or 70,000, God forbid, that was first dollar, $70,000 second year? Is that okay?
In 3 years.
Okay, but so for sure. And we've benefited. We've been really lucky in that the Canadian dollar has fallen relatively, so that's been great for our revenue stream because we do everything in American dollars.
You got to hope for now. For other reasons.
Yeah, but to be clear, the United States is an awesome market.
Yeah.
I think my premise is simply that Canada is not big enough to be a scaling company in most industries.
Yes.
Of course there's exceptions. But in most industries, you do the math and you've got, 20 million homes times whatever you're selling. It's not enough.
So we have to go outside of Canada, absolutely. Right. And my view is that too often I hear that your first step has to be in the US, and I just think, no, it is a possible first step, but there are many other options as well to consider.
I think Kayla had a question, and we'll get to you, Glenn. Kayla?
Thanks so much for coming out. That's awesome. So I'm wondering, earlier on you said that you decided to stay away from Toronto and go straight to the U.S. I know you just spoke a little bit to staying away from Canada, but could you elaborate more on the reasons behind not trying something in Toronto?
Oh, okay, so these are two different stories, so I probably confused them. In the case of avoiding Toronto, we were doing, it's a telecommunications company, and we were actually laying physical plant, in that case, fiber optic cables. So that deployment, we avoided Toronto because it was dense. Number one, it's super expensive. So out here, you could probably run a fiber for $37,000 a click, let's say. Downtown Toronto, we can get up to $1 million for 1 kilometer. So that's one. And the other one is, here you might compete with 2 others. In downtown Toronto, you might compete with 7 or 8 or 9 others. It's also very ferociously fought because all the financials are the best customers for that industry. So we thought, let's tool up, get smart, get capable, and really be strong before we descend onto the toughest market space. So that was very much a guerrilla warfare mentality on our part. Stay in the hills, get strong, poke nobody, do all the B cities, and then go after the A city. SSIMWAVE is very different. We're a software company. We're 100% software. We have no hardware. So for us, the world is a market for us. It's all a matter of regulatory and other issues, but it would be very, very different. And so in this particular case, the center of the entertainment business is the United States, and so it was a very natural place for SSIMWAVE to begin. Is that a good answer? Yeah, I think I just confused the two.
If I can go back to the point of experience, Steve brings a wealth of experience to SSIMWAVE, and if a company doesn't have that experience, this process of step-step consolidation and really get our act together, know what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it, how come we're doing well? That's an important question, to know why it is that you're growing well. Mm-hmm. A lot of companies don't necessarily understand that always, and I've seen both in software and hardware companies that have taken that, just for the first 2 or 3 years, a fairly incremental approach to what they're doing, maybe going from Finland to Sweden or Denmark into the Nordics or into Germany. That's a big leap for some of the Nordic countries, if I use them for an example, or New Zealand into Australia. Get that sorted out, and that gives you the confidence and the credibility, a point made earlier, and a little bit of savvy and a better network to be able to say, okay, now I'm going to go from New Zealand, Australia, which I've locked, into Singapore or into the UK, or from Finland and the Nordics into, right now I'm going to tackle the US. And that process of learning in that first 2 to 3 years can be really helpful.
Glenn, you had a question?
Yeah, springboards exactly off that, Nicole. I wanted to understand if you had 1 or 2 examples that you could share with us. So you mentioned Scandinavian or UK companies going around the U.S. in order to better understand how to engage in their go-to-market approach. Do you have 1 or 2 examples we can share?
Yeah.
In more detail?
Yep. I'll think of it. There's this is a software company that was based in Christchurch in New Zealand, and developing technology to go into war zones, basically, and identify in-ground, in-water danger zones, mines and things like that. And they knew ultimately that was their market. If they needed to be, ultimately they wanted to be dealing with the US military. It's kind of like the Ariane but underground kind of approach. This goes back a while. And what they did was they built up relationships going in through the UK and then back into the Middle East, where they set up business there, and then they ultimately got into the US by virtue of showing the credibility of networking internationally, coming back into the Middle East where it really was a hot zone, and then they have now business with the US. Well, they put their hand up for sale ultimately, and that company is closely allied with the Black Ops in the US.
So primarily through networks. So basically
Absolutely.
developing a network to get to their end.
And that's the same story I would tell over and over again, is that they've identified that if they want to get there, they have to backtrack to get here, to get there, and who do they know and how do they know it, and how can they possibly strategically leverage those relationships. And the big issue is figuring out who's the power broker and how do you get to that power broker. And inevitably there is a way, because they don't, we talk about 6 degrees of separation for a reason. We are all connected somehow. And if you can map that out and figure it out, it's a path.
Excellent. Okay, Mike, you had a question in the back?
Yeah, so good discussion about going into various markets, maybe outside the US, maybe in Australia and things like that. But what can you share some of your thoughts with tipping point considerations to actually set up locally in other countries, and what are some of the factors that you guys have experienced? You mentioned the States. You set up an entity there immediately. That was a little bit for hiring, but what are some of the other considerations maybe for setting up or making a decision to hire locally in the countries that you're looking at?
Well, the United States is, I'll caution everybody, because I've been burnt, be careful about setting up in the United States. It's exceptionally important. You have a couple options. If you get it wrong, you could suffer double taxation on capital gains. It was a huge fight for us with a company that I was with previously. We were ultimately successful. So I went there knowing, the moment I showed up, I said, whoop, because, from pain and bad experience. So I would say mostly it's cultural for us. And so I did want to circle back. We went to Amsterdam in September for a big show and talked to some of the folks there. And I have to tell you, the amount of assistance that you can get is spectacular. Like in France, which I was told to avoid because it was very difficult to do business there from a red tape point of view, the opposite. They were so tremendously helpful. So I think, and then in Japan, it's the one place to date where we're actually doing a channel model. And the reason is because we clearly have to. So I guess, Michael, the answer would be that it's all cultural and how business gets done. One of the things that I thought was interesting here with Communitech is those that were successful on their first international went to a country that one of their founders or a couple of the people inside the company were from. So there was no fear, there was family there, they spoke the language, so they immediately attuned themselves to culture. So it's a combination of regulatory tax and understanding how you have to sell in that country.
Or just comment there, we talk about those particular entrepreneurs as returnee entrepreneurs, is that they're going home and they're going back into the network that they know, and that even if it wasn't their network when they left the country, because they have family and related ties there, it's something. The other thing around, and I'll talk, when I'm talking here, I'm talking about small resource-constrained firms, when they're thinking that maybe this is a strategically important market, we really need to have a setup there. We need to have people on the ground representing us. The inclination is to say, let's hire somebody, maybe either hire Canadian and move them into that marketplace, or let's hire somebody in that marketplace. If it's that strategically important, and I've seen this borne out in the research, and the nice thing about doing research is that while I don't have, and I'll be clear here, is that I'm talking from looking across lots of different companies. I don't have that kind of rich experience that you have.
No,
No, you're rich. I'm poor.
You have a pension.
Except for the 17 years I was in New Zealand with no pension plan. That's all off the point here. But if you are resource constrained, and it is a vital market that you are in, the person that and your top management team, one of your top management team is the one that goes. It's not somebody that you hire in, and it's not somebody that you appoint over there. If it's that important, you've got to have top dog on the ground in that market.
And just on that point, we also had a Terminal Tech Talk speaker a couple of talks ago, Alan Canestraro, who founded Rayo after spending 13 years at Apple and 3 years at Facebook. And he himself is moving his company from the Valley to Canada. And we also had another Tech Talk speaker, Vikram.
And he's driving that move and coming up.
That's right. And so that's to your point about you returning home to your roots kind of thing. Yeah.
Questions?
So I kind of add a dimension to the conversation. So when we talk about software, we have to kind of differentiate B2B and B2C. So I'm a B2C company. So how does your advice about going into US versus international versus, and then differentiating developing countries versus first world countries like UK versus Brazil? How does that kind of change your advice about going to the US versus Brazil for B2C?
So the question is for the people on live stream, for a B2C company, how do you differentiate between going into different markets?
Because you talk to VCs in B2C space, it's like you have to go to US. You have to, those most valuable users, you have to get them. And they won't value any other user the same way. It's crazy, but like how does your advice change for that? From B2B to B2C?
It would depend on the product, I guess, right? Does the product translate all the cultures and all the countries? I mean, is it widely desired by people, or?
So, like, I guess I should back up. Like, I know you didn't want to talk about specifics, but like we are a video company. We generate video, we generate music, we generate stuff for people to watch together. So it is a very social and dynamic environment.
So now you've got language issues.
Yeah.
You've got the issue of how many people will watch it, if it's subtitled or dubbed. You've got whether or not it's funny. Jerry Lewis is funny in Paris, not so much
Nowhere.
for me. So I think you've got a much harder decision. We sell to people that sell to customers. So we think a lot about the customers because all the money in our industry comes from the viewer. So we do think about them a lot. But I don't have to worry about, in fact, going to Europe, the first question we asked was, how many languages do we need our documentation in? Right? And the answer was like 3, because most people there in the tech business will do English. For you, wow. It's every single language.
But is it? And I say this because, so my husband's German, and we were in Germany at Christmas, and talking to my husband's cousin, who has never had English training and has learned how to speak English by watching YouTube. Okay? And that's his mechanism for learning. So, and everything he does is in English because of it. And he's a B2C. He's the C in this equation. One of the companies I'm in love with at the moment is Wattpad. And I came to understand Wattpad quite late, and it was actually quite recently. And we had a 19-year-old visiting us from Finland, kind of an unusual young woman. And we're walking through Indigo, and I said, so tell me, you know, I'm in a bookstore, right? What do you like to read? Oh, I don't read. And I was like, oh, thinking we were in the wrong place. And then she picks up a book, and she says, oh, this is poetry. And like she was surprised to see it in book form. And I said, yeah. I said, do you like poetry? And she said, well, yeah, I read poetry. And I said, oh, I thought you didn't read. And she said, oh, well, I'm on Wattpad. And she reads and writes music and poetry. She's 19 years old, based in the far north of Finland. And Wattpad is her go-to as a B2C type of environment. And it's all international, and it's all in, well, it's in multiple languages, but English is a dominant language in there. So what I encourage people to do often is look at analogous products. Look at companies that are kind of close enough to yours, but not the same as yours, so you have something new to learn, but you can also mimic what it is they're doing. And find a company like that. And maybe it is a Wattpad that says, how is it that they've managed to go kaboom as they have done?
Yes, Jeff?
Yeah, so you're both my favorites as well. Oh, you know you're my favorite, because you once singled out tonight as being my favorite, so you're my favorite. I get the big picture about making choices and making bets, but you know, America isn't one homogeneous market. And if you determine that you can play in California or New York or wherever, then you may not be able to play in other states. So what's your product? How does it fit? What are the regulations? And I don't think it's binary that you just avoid America and go small, or you go in whole hog. It's a matter of which vertical markets you want to play in, and how best can you play in. And,
although Steve's made the point that, I mean, you've got just 5 customers, but they're in 40 states. So that is part of the equation. And the U.S. has done just tons of research on this issue of internationalization, really tremendous scholars. But it wasn't until probably 1980 before they recognized that if you sold from Wisconsin to California, it wasn't exporting. And that's, yeah, but it is, you know, like we kind of giggle at it, and I do giggle at it, but they are unique and distinct geographic markets and cultural markets and language markets and taxation markets and all sorts of things. If you can restrict your customers to that market, that makes it more attractive. If your customers and if you're following your customers and they're spread across markets, it becomes more of a challenge.
Yeah, and I certainly wasn't trying to undermine the thesis of like you've got to choose when are you ready to attack big markets. But it is a huge market, and if you just break it down into small pieces, you can have a lot of fun in the American market. Just don't think it's one homogeneous market.
And to be clear, I wasn't saying don't go to the U.S. I mean, we're in the U.S. I think, number one, understand where your customers might be. Do the usual product market fit stuff and all the things everyone knows, but my premise is that most likely you have to go international. And when you're building your team here, to go back on topic for your sake, Nabil, when you build your team here, think about that already. So, you often think about going on trips. And, of course, if you're going on a trip, you think about how much you have to carry, and you're going to get a vehicle that's commensurate with that. Now think about it as, I don't know what I'm going to carry 5 years from now, but I need the vehicle to carry it 5 years from now. So this is business planning, and it's really difficult. And so, to me, the start planning now for being international will change every single decision that gets made by the company from this moment forward. The people we hire, how rapidly we need people with greater experience, how many people I'd like to attract that have come from another country, who understands the cultures of the places we've already decided we want to go. I mean, all of them start now, and if I hire all the wrong people, then I'm going to have to reinvent the entire company to go international. So I think my premise is start knowing you will have to go international.
At some point.
At some point. Okay. If you want to scale your company, and this is about scaling companies. And to me, a scaling company is a company that's on a course to be making $1 billion a year in revenues.
So I saw your hand there, we'll come back to that in just a second. Sorry, Nabil, you're actually the moderator. I had a conversation. I was interested to know, through the grapevine I'd heard something, and so I reached out to Lauren Paddleford at Shopify last year and said, tell me just when you started thinking strategically about international markets. And he he's quite blunt to the point, and he said, this year. And I said, okay, so everything up until this year has just been, you pressed a button, you were international, the business came in, and it was what it was, and now you're thinking about it. He says, yep, we're 14 years old, now we're thinking about it. And so a SaaS firm, by virtue literally of pressing a button, is instantly international, has the potential to have people reaching it from all over the world. Shopify has gotten away with it because the nature of their business at that point in time was spot on. And they were able to kind of ride the cresting wave, but not everybody's going to be able to do that. Some of them are going to be underneath that wave. And so thinking about these things as you launch your SaaS firm, knowing that you are international, stuff's going to come your way, maybe faster than you think, how you're going to deal with it. Good question.
I just want to make a point that markets are not necessarily corrupt. We're a software company. We have 6 customers. They're all Fortune 500 companies. And we engage with some of them through the European market, some of them through the bank, some through the same, but now we're dealing with them as well. Because once you're in, now you start kind of working with different business divisions. And some of them
through those customers.
Yeah. But once you're inside this big organization that has divisions everywhere, that's your market.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Congratulations on having 6 Fortune 500 customers.
That's awesome. Mo, you had a question? Yeah.
I was going to ask, if all of your customers are overseas and your talent is here, is there, I imagine there'd be a large gap of education required for all of the talent here so that they could continue to breed the right features into the product for the customers overseas. And I think of Kik, and maybe I just don't know Kik very well, but I don't really know what Kik does, but they're doing really well apparently, wherever they're doing it. And so I think as talent here, I am nervous to apply, if there was an opening, at Kik, because I can't relate to what they do. Is there a bit of a risk, and how do you overcome that?
I think you need that virtual sales cycle thing going on, because the only way to feed information, no matter where your company is for the people on the street to feed it back to it. And so I don't think being international really changes that paradigm. To Jeff's point, in the United States, you go to Louisiana, you're not speaking to the same kind of people you are in Boston. And so you need the people on the ground to tell you, especially on a B2C, where it's particularly a sensitive environment. Companies to companies tends to be a little bit different, but I would say get that circle going. So, and that's a tough thing to do, by the way. Engineers don't want to listen to salespeople. Salespeople want to yell at engineers, but they have to be doing that constant feedback to say, hey, you know what? We'd sell twice as many if it was a different color in this country. Right.
Just is anybody here from Bidvine? No? okay? My niece was working at Bidvine, and their R&D team was here, and she was brought in to kind of be a bit of a, well, she was doing content and things like that, but she was the only marketing type person on the ground here. Everybody else, because their market is in the UK, everybody else was in the UK. And what they were trying to do was have this conversation between the UK and Canada and UK and Canada. But they had part of the Canadian, the team, the management team was there, part of it was here, and then they had a system worked out, so there was this constant process of interaction that seemed to work. I mean, virtual meetings, which we could never do before, we can do all the time now. And it's changed my life for sure, because university professors do not get to travel in anything other than the economy either.
David?
Question for Nicole, and I realize that the answer, if there is one, is maybe regionally specific as opposed to global, but my question is, are there certain markets sub of the US that have a higher than average relationship with longer term success as the stepping stones? And I'm thinking in terms of like the political analogy. In the US, the microcosm is Missouri in many respects. It has many of the same demographic, west, east, urban, rural, sort of proportionalities that exist in the larger country. So, there's certain things that can be done more efficiently and measured that way that have some extensibility to a nationwide view. And now, in the case of developing business, going to Spanish-speaking Latin American countries, as an example.
That's what you mean by sub.
Yeah.
Okay.
The example, and there would be a similar question about going to Asia. Is there a sequence of land and expand from one country to the next, where certain kingpin countries, while small, tend to have a higher correlation with later success expanding out, at least in the region? Or has as far as you're aware, has anybody ever spent some time looking at that?
Excuse me, for the live stream, the question is there a sequence of countries that you go to when you knock one down from a kingpin country and so on and so forth? So is there best practices around sequencing of countries, effectively?
There is research done on this. It does depend on the kind of product. So if we're talking about financial accounting software, you want to hit Singapore, and that's your market. If you're talking about something that's more in the like a handheld type of a marketplace, you hit the Nordic countries and then you move south from the Nordic countries. So you Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and then down into Germany. But it is product dependent. Into Latin America is really interesting. I don't know if you remember your readings on this, Nabil, or Ellie, or Megan. We have other MBAers in here as well. But it is the shades of difference that move across Latin America, and you go from Panama to Buenos Aires to Argentina to Venezuela. They have very different buying approaches and decision-making processes and managerial decision-making processes. And you'd think, oh, it's all a Latin culture, but it's not. And I don't have the answer specific to Latin America, except to say that Latin America is, again, probably 12 different markets.
Go ahead, speak up.
So, in the past few years, the most exciting markets have moved away from what used to be primarily Western world, like US or Europe, to Asia or Latin America and stuff. And how do you build teams which are very comfortable working in those environments? Because until you were say US was your biggest market, or it was easy because the culture and you understood the system, taxation, whatever, common law. But as the most exciting economies are, let's say, far away now, right? How do you overcome that challenge as you plan out your organization and scale it up? Because it's no longer that easy. Like it's no longer UK and the US. Right?
Are you talking tech employees or management or everybody?
I would say more management, because tech is somewhat homogeneous. But that's very hard to do, because the future growth is in those economies. That's where you might want to go first.
Well, knowledge for sure. Firsthand, we were in China. We were trying to unlock China for startups in Canada, give them an easier entry because it was complicated. And we were lucky enough to be assigned a couple of high-end lawyers, Chinese lawyers, native mainland Chinese lawyers, who, by the way, had been trained at Harvard in the United States as well as in China. And so the first thing they told us was, number one, you don't want to hire us. You want to become very familiar with the people that are the agents in the IP world, not the lawyers in our IP world. Number one, we're really expensive. We're like $1,600 an hour or some crazy number like that. But we really don't know the system. So the knowledge that we gained just in a couple hours from them telling us who really understood how to work the system was absolutely invaluable. So
Were they based here?
No, they were based there.
They were based there, okay.
And with lots of connections into the Valley, because there's several VCs in the Valley that do both. But nonetheless, the point was we knew nothing. Like we knew less than nothing. And so just 2 hours with them was gold. And then the more you talked, the more you learned. There's no shortcut. So the only shortcut is to get the expert that you can trust. It's one or the other. Either you're going to learn an awful lot and do deep research, slow you down, or you're going to buy it. And then can you buy someone you can trust is the hard part.
I think we see too with, and this is coming from the Lazaridis 10 experiences, is that if you can capture an expert's interest, yes, you're paying for 2 hours worth of legal time, that's going to be a pretty hefty investment, but if you capture their interest, the doors they open are going to be worth that. And that's the unlocking of the key. The other thing I would suggest, if you do need to have that kind of referral, but I think too is that I see that we are increasingly getting more and more. I've got 3 in my MBA, not MBA, an international marketing class right now, and they're here to get the training to go home. But they are Chinese nationals with living in Canada for 4 years with a Canadian undergraduate degree to go home so they can straddle both worlds. And that kind of a talent or an asset is also important because they have the networks, they have an appreciation of where you're coming from, they even know Waterloo. So,
Rob, you had a question?
Yeah. A little while back, Steve, you mentioned that being intentional about how you're starting your company can confer some really good advantages when scaling and stuff. I wonder does starting a company as being remote-centric give you significant advantages to scaling globally? And if so, is that enough to mitigate any disadvantages that might come from not having a local team, especially in the early years?
Sorry, can you explain remote-centric?
Everybody's elsewhere.
Yeah, everybody's elsewhere. No central office.
Oh, you don't have one at all. There is no hub.
Or the majority of the team is working in different locations.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Like there's like Basecamp as an example,
Yep.
Wufu as an example.
Yeah, I've never run a company that was that highly distributed. The most offices I've had is 8, which I found challenging. But actually, we did a model not unlike Nicole referenced, and that is what we decided to do instead of go local is one senior leader was in each of the 8 offices, and it didn't matter what their expertise was. And then their job was to champion the market, both the local market as in our customers, but also all the employees that worked there. I've never run a truly virtual company like you're referencing, so I don't think I have a good answer for you.
Have you seen anything?
Yeah, I have. One of our current cohort companies, it's called Tiny Eye Therapies, and it's an unusual name, but it's referring to the tiny eye on your computer screen. They do remote language therapy for kids all over North America, so in the north and everywhere, basically. And they have this team of it's something like 200 people that are all over North America supporting students in and out of the school system. They have probably not grown as rapidly as you might like to grow because they've had to build out that network. Once it's stable and in place, their goal is to take it to another level because now they have the expertise of managing that type of organization. They're based in Saskatoon, and I'm sure if you wanted to talk to them, they'd be happy to talk to you. Yeah. Anybody from Saskatoon is happy to talk.
That's awesome. So at the Lazaridis Institute, you guys are working with some of like the global thought leaders on scaling. The names that come to mind are like Reid Hoffman and the Masters of Scale, founder and chairman of LinkedIn.
And Chris Ye, who's his co-author, who is our partner, yes.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
As well, like I do a lot of reading on like paulgraham.com, and one of his most famous essays there, read by millions worldwide, the former president of Y Combinator, is in the early days, like in the inception part of building businesses, since we have a lot of founders in the audience, right? Some of the focus in the earliest of days is do things that don't scale. And then, very famously, you look at some massive businesses today, like Airbnb in their portfolio, or Stripe, and these types of businesses, their founders were relentless in the early days about focusing on those kind of non-scalable interactions in the early days, right? So do you have any thoughts about, as you grow, and at what point do you start to hit, that mentality where you have to kind of phase out of that and get into things where you're building for scale and the iterations of your company?
So I'll just speak to the Lazaridis research that we've been doing, and year after year now, so just 3 years, because we're just turning 3, 6 years seems to be a maturity mark of some sort. So what makes a difference for growth seems to split at 6 years. So if you're a young firm, it's investment in sales, investment in marketing. And if you're an older firm, it is shifting away from sales and marketing, and then the integration of marketing and sales, for example. We find that for the younger firms, there's really not much else that matters. It's getting your selling. It's getting your customers, basically, and getting your company in the marketplace. R&D investment is always the highest on if we're talking about R&D as a percentage of revenue, it's always the highest investment in the organization, but it is not the one that contributes to growth. And the older you get, it tends to have a negative association with growth. Yeah. So the emphasis is moving away from, you've got to have your product in play and you've got to be leading in that area, but it's the investment in selling and marketing. Yeah, for the younger firms. And at about 6 years, it seems to change. And we kind of let the data speak for itself. And that was, I should also clarify, and it's only been in the last couple of years we've distinguished between SaaS and non-SaaS firms, and now we're getting a finer level of distinction. So it will again be product or company business model specific. But referring back to the academic literature, 6 years seems to also come through over and over again.
Yeah, the magic number I think that YC typically uses is that, like, he uses an example, if you have 100 users and you're growing 10% week over week, after 2 years you have like 2 million users. So focusing on...
For that type of a business model though, right? So
These are outliers, though. I would caution you. People spend way too much time talking about outliers, and so even in the Valley, they talk about the same 7 companies over and over and over again. And there's 60,000 companies. It doesn't make any sense. And so, if you broad brush it, I would say the other intentional thing would be: do you want to be massive? Is your objective to simply be massive? And I think lots of companies want to be known for quality. I think we often use Tiffany's versus Walmart, but the same would go from Lamborghini versus Toyota. The truth in the world is that the small car companies out-earned the big car companies many-fold, and ultimately now own them all. But the guys doing that very high-end automobile, that was the purpose of the work. Right. And so I think people appreciate companies that know why they're in the business that they're in, and that they stay true to that. So in our case, we would not follow your model.
Okay.
The R&D is imperative. Everything about the company I'm with now, SSIMWAVE, is built on the excellence of its science. And in fact, the entire team will say the only objective of the team is to be true to the science.
In fact, you won an Emmy Award, Primetime Emmy Award for the engineering.
And I'm not disagreeing with that, because if we took the 100%, 60% of that revenue is going into the R&D and the science.
Right.
But, or 70, or 80, or 90. And if it's getting that high, what you're compromising here is the investment into your market, which is the selling and the marketing.
Yeah, and we're trying to balance those things.
Oh, there we go.
Right? No, but we're balancing. But I don't imagine it will ever become less than 30 or 40% of the company's revenues.
Okay.
For the simple reason that the entire company rests on that technology.
Most of the firms that we study, it sits at about 60% for R&D. And we're talking about maybe in the, like 30% sales, 20% marketing, and until you're about 6, and then it evens out at about 20-20, and then the rest is R&D. Yeah. But the highest growth firms, they are really putting first and foremost, they put the talent, they put the effort, they're trying to get their sales and their marketing right. And they're two distinct activities. Yeah.
We probably have time for just like one or two more questions, if there's any more questions in the audience. Raul?
Yeah, there's a big discussion going on here about having a network on the ground and understanding culture to a large extent. With the import of those two things, I haven't heard anyone speak really about Global Affairs Canada and the trade commissioners and their expertise being on the ground in over 160 different cities across the globe. What kind of support?
It's in my notes.
I think that's an asset that's oftentimes overlooked, and I'm wondering from your perspective, what type of support do they afford companies that are looking to export into these various jurisdictions?
I did have it in my notes, honest. What I was going to say when I said earlier, get help, was in the case of Amsterdam, it was the local economic development people that would go so far as to help us find an office, like an actual office, hands-on. Here you've got all of the consulates will help you, you've got Communitech will help you, you've got the AC Velocity will help if you ask, even if you weren't a UW person. I've never known them to turn anyone away. You will help people. I would say you'd be a fool not to connect with all of these. We connected to them, well, everywhere. And in fact, we're going to MWC, which is the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. The first event that I go to will be an event hosted by the embassy. And they asked us who we'd like to be there. We gave them 7, and these are multinationals. They've got 5 of 7 are coming to the reception for us. We could never have done that by ourselves.
But I'm also going to point out that you're SSIMWAVE. Right? So it's not going to be the same experience for all companies. Some companies are going to it's going to be easier to bring in those potential customers or partners than it is for an unknown quantity.
I was just trying to say we could never have done it.
No.
By ourselves.
Yes.
Right.
And so this is where the outside agencies and the government agencies do come in handy.
Yeah.
I think from a new startup perspective, I've heard mixed results. In terms of, and that in part could be because the people who are trying to get help don't know what they're looking for, and so they can't give you enough direction. So it's a kind of a mixed thing there.
Yeah, I mean,
but the resources that are available, tremendous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but the kind of the strength of a network and the international network, like to bring it a little bit closer to home. As an example, we have a bunch of different businesses in here. One of the businesses that was part of the Atomic portfolio in the early days was EverAlbum. The CEO there was Adam Dudum, and I was connected to Andrew Dudum through Liam Horn. Liam Horn was a Peter Thiel fellow, right? So you follow it back, right? But ultimately now Andrew Dudum is the CEO of HIMSS, and they've raised, I think, over $100 million. Some of their team is on the other side of this wall and whatnot. But you trace it back to like the strengths of those kind of relationships, and you could see some of that impact. Whether it be leveraging government or embassy contacts, or whether it be leveraging your private sector network that way, and so
all of it.
Yeah,
all of it.
You got to leverage it all. Yeah, exactly. And so and then on the other side, the Lauren Paddleford example is also another good one, because they were able to land and expand here, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that in helping them open their first 3 offices in town here. And so, and even seeing that business grow from 0 to 300, 400 now, I don't know however many they are now, locally. They're 3,000 plus globally, right? Is pretty staggering, right? But again, it was reach outs through your network of people you trust.
But you have to know your network, and this is one of the exercises we didn't do in the program when you were there, but I have done a number of times in the past. Is we get people who are coming in to do some sort of training. They are entrepreneurs, they're running their own business, and so we start doing a network map. And I know either the attitude is I've done it all myself, or I know who my network is, and I say, well, let's get it on paper. And then their sheet of paper gets bigger, and they start taping it together, and then they come into my office with, 20 pieces of paper taped together, and they put it on the floor. And this happens regularly in this process, and it's like, holy shit. And they're looking at it saying, so I'm spending way too much time over there, and there's this big hole over here, and I can see how I can go from here to here. And it's this process of drawing it out, thinking about it, talking to the people that you know and trust about, oh no, oh, you forgot that person, what about that person? That's the strategic intent around a network, rather than thinking that you know it, or you've got it on LinkedIn. So just, you guys probably all have 500 plus, 1,000 plus, mostly useless contacts.
I just have Nabil.
You just have Nabil. And I just have Nabil.
This is all you need, right here, right here.
Who's your favorite?
And he's my favorite.
But think about, go through that exercise and think, and then strategically say, okay, we can spend less time there, we can do more stuff over here.
So I just wanted to mention a couple last comments. First of all, there's a bunch of founders in the room. There's at least a couple of North employees I'm seeing. There's, I think Jerry Reimers is here, who used to run Christie Digital for many, many years locally. So if you want to stick around and meet some awesome people, there's some particularly interesting people in the room. There's Corbin there, is the co-director of Hack the North. If you're interested in hackathons, he's a thought leader in that regard. I think we have somebody tuning in from Kansas City on the live stream that I wanted to give a quick shout out to. Trevor Hurley Braun's nephew. But in any case, the last thing I wanted to mention is if you don't know about our business here at Terminal, what we do is we bring global opportunities to talent. So there's a number of different companies that we represent across Canada that are high growth technology businesses. And if you'd like to learn more about that, just simply visit terminal.io, speak to me, speak to Tanya, speak to anybody on our team. We're always happy to help you learn more about those opportunities. We're privileged to be here in Kitchener-Waterloo. We love being in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto as well. And I'm particularly proud of the however many jobs we've created all across the country. So thank you very much for joining us, and please feel free to stick around for a little bit. And the last thing I'll say is, Saj, how did Steve do?
He did pretty good.
Okay. Saj is the VP of Marketing at SSIMWAVE, for those who don't know Saj.
Saj wrote everything I said, so if you didn't like it,
thanks everyone for coming out. We'll be around for a bit.